Good morning. It's 6:45. I've been spending the last 4 weeks trying to figure out what nationalism is and how to teach it to you. And now it's crunch time. I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but we're going to figure it out. Hey everyone. Before we go any further, I just want to remind you that we are going to have a 25% off sale today on all the new merch. Make sure you click on the link down below or over here or possibly around me. And also smash that bell, my friends, so that you get updates from this channel every time I upload a new video. So today we're going to be talking about nationalism, and I'll be perfectly honest, I have spent the last 3 weeks or so trying to figure out how to make nationalism funny, because it is one of those topics within global studies that's a little, it's an is thing. It's a very important is, but it's an is. It's not funny. So I thought I would go ask some experts, some friends, some people that I know, if they could explain nationalism to you. Maybe they could dress it up a little bit in a way that I couldn't. So let's roll that.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
We cannot sustain. Oops.
Was that my, where were we? Let me be absolutely clear. Israel is a strong friend of Israel's.
Recently, I received a letter from Masayasu Okumura. Oh, damn it.
I hear there's rumors on the internet.
Okay, that didn't so much work. So I guess what I'll do is I'll read from my notes. I don't know. It seems like a good idea. So nationalism is the sense of belonging, of a people belonging together as a nation. Prior to nations, you had kingdoms, and if you were a member of a kingdom, you were essentially the product or property of a king or an emperor. Now that we're starting to talk about nations in the early 1800s, we're talking about the shift from being a subject to being a citizen. Now, instead of seeing yourself as the property of a king, you are the member of a nation. And with that comes a sense of loyalty, a sense of commonality. You usually share a common set of cultural markers like language, history, traditions. There's a great deal of loyalty to the nation itself. And oftentimes, nationalism can do a couple things. Nationalism often will unify people. That tends to be a good thing. Nationalism can divide people, and it's questionable as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. And nationalism can lead to independence movements. So in your notes, I want you to make sure to copy down the definition of nationalism, and then also make sure to write down that nationalism can unify, divide, or lead to independence movements. That's super important. When we're talking about nationalism, we're going to use two terms that matter greatly: a nation and a state. And those two things are very different. Box number one. I don't know why I pointed down here, because you're probably watching this on a screen and your notes are over here. Wherever your notes are, there's a box there. Okay, nation. A nation is the people. So when we talk about the German nation, which we're going to, the German nation, that's the people that live in Germany that call themselves German. If we were to talk about the American nation, that's us. It's a group of people that have a shared language, culture, heritage, history, shared customs, that sort of thing. A state is very different, and a state is the other box. A state is very different. A state is the government. So if we were to talk about, again, the German nation, that's the people. If we talk about the German state, that's the government. Two different things. Sometimes you'll hear your global studies teacher talk about a nation state. In that point, we are combining those concepts. So put that information in the boxes. Good enough. One of the things that often fuels nations is symbol. Nationalism is something that that thrives on symbol. Each morning we get up and we come to school, and the first thing that, well, not anymore, now it's like the beginning of second block, but at the beginning of second block, we all, or generally most of us, stand and we face a symbol and we say something called the Pledge of Allegiance. All of that whole ritual is nationalism. It is ingraining the core values of the United States into our children. And it gets to the point where we don't even think about it when we say it. I mean, have you ever thought about what you're saying as you're saying it? Here, let's do this for just a second. Thought experiment. I pledge allegiance. What does it mean to pledge allegiance? Well, that means that you are committing to a certain sense of loyalty to something. You are pledging your faithfulness to something. So what are you pledging allegiance to? You're promising your faithfulness to, I pledge allegiance to the flag. That's what we're facing. A piece of cloth with symbols on it that represents shared history, culture of a specific group of people. We are pledging our faithfulness to this piece of cloth of the United States of America, a specific country, and to the republic for which that piece of cloth represents, and to the republic for which it stands. So we are pledging our faithfulness and loyalty to the symbol of our representative federalist republic, the experiment that started like 243 years ago or something like that. That's a little head math, so I'm not good at math, so round it. We're pledging allegiance to the flag of our country and the republic, the government for which it stands. And then there are some clauses. It is one nation. It used to be two for like 4 years. It was two. We had the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. So when this pledge was drafted in the 1890s, that was important. One nation. Under God was added in the 1940s, I believe, after World War II. And that was super important because it represented a distinction between what Americans viewed as a religious country, a Christian country, and godless communism, which we were fighting in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that was a big deal. One nation, not divided, under God, indivisible. You can't break it apart. It functions as a whole with liberty, freedom, and justice, fairness in the court system, fairness in the laws for all. That's what we pledge every morning for those of us who participate in that ritual. It's important that we think about what we are agreeing to. We are making a promise every morning to our nation. This is part of nationalism and probably the most accurate representation that you experience in your day. At the bottom of your first page, what I'd like you to do is over the course of the next couple of days, as you're going about your life, I want you to find other examples of nationalism. Other examples, be they flags, campaign signs, people engaging in some sort of patriotic ritual, and without being intrusive, of course, I want you to take a picture of that and take that picture and place it into the grid. I want you to find 3 of them. And then below that picture, I want you to explain to me why that symbol is a symbol of nationalism, is a symbol of loyalty to a specific country or a specific idea, how that symbol shows shared culture and heritage, shared language and tradition. See what you can find. Go on a little scavenger hunt, go on a walk, take your puppy or your cat or your gerbil or your ferret or your bird. I don't know. Maybe you have a falcon at home. Take it on a walk and go see what you can find in terms of nationalism. And then when we come back, we're going to take a look at 3 examples of nationalism. We're going to look at how nationalism led to independence movements in Latin America. We're going to look at how nationalism divided parts of Germany and then united parts of Germany. And we're also going to look at how nationalism united Italy. Okay, go have fun. Go take a walk. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed the walk. Hope you found some nationalism out there. If you turn to the next page, we're going to talk a little bit about nationalism as an independence movement. To begin with, we need to set the scene a little bit. The revolutions in Latin America in the early 1800s were a direct result of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So you just finished working with Napoleon. Napoleon, the not so short but super arrogant French leader. That's almost synonymous. It doesn't matter. Anyway, not so short, super arrogant French leader who tried to set up the French Empire. It's a little cold. Tried to set up the French Empire in Europe. In doing so, he waged war against all of his neighbors, including Spain to the south of him. Spain had all sorts of colonies in the New World, particularly in the Caribbean and Central America and South America. As they're engaging in this war with Napoleon, most of their resources are going to be focused on protecting their domestic border as opposed to maintaining their colonies that are kind of half a world away. This leads to a perfect opportunity for a growing and already festering frustration, somewhat based upon Enlightenment ideas, to boil over. The Latin American leaders of the time, your upper middle class intellectual, the bourgeoisie of Latin America, had seen the Americans and the French go into revolutions against their monarchs, and the idea was appealing. If you look in your notes, Latin American colonies were primarily controlled by Spain, though You do have Portuguese colonies, Dutch colonies, and French colonies. Our main focus is going to be the Spanish colonies. For the Spanish, really controlled the vast majority of the region. And they controlled it using a policy called mercantilism. Mercantilism is essentially, mercantilism is essentially an economic policy that looks to benefit the mother country more than benefit anything else. It's an economic policy under which nations sought to increase their own wealth and power by obtaining large amounts of natural resources, particularly gold and silver, and by selling more goods than they import, essentially setting up what's called a favorable balance of trade. Additionally, within the colonies, within the Spanish colonies, they had a strict social hierarchy in the same manner as France. In all honesty, it's a system. A strict social hierarchy is usually there so that a monarch or a central government, a single party of sorts, has control over the people below them, held in place by this rigid set of social classes. In the Spanish colonies, those social classes were different than in other colonies. At the top of the social hierarchy are peninsulares. Peninsulares are Spanish-born people who were born in Spain and emigrated. They left Spain for the new colonies. So they are Spanish-born people. More than likely, they come with a decent amount of wealth because that trip is an expensive one, and they would tend not to go to the New World unless there was a good economic reason for them to, particularly land. So peninsulares tended to be rather wealthy. Once they arrive in Spain, should they choose to multiply, their children, once they arrive in the New World, in the colonies, should these peninsulares decide to multiply, their children would be in the next rung down, which is kind of an interesting thing. They don't inherit the same social standing as their parents. The children of peninsulares, Spanish-born or Spanish blood, pure Spanish blood, but born in the colonies, they're called creoles. And they will be the focus of revolution. In fact, the guy that we're going to look at in some detail is a creole. The next rung down and the rungs below them, you'll notice, are split vertically. This split is unique to the Latin American colonies. When colonizers come into a new world, they often will either kill or enslave the native people. The British were no different with the Native Americans, the Spanish with the South Americans, the Dutch and the French as well. Colonizers tend to do that. The native-born people that weren't killed were enslaved. And oftentimes, you would have children come from a Spanish slave owner and a Latin American native slave. Or you would have children, I'm getting garbled. Oftentimes, you would have slave owners who are Spanish-born having children with their Native American slaves, the ones they've taken. That makes up one side of your triangle. You have mulattoes, who are children of Spanish-born or pure Spanish ethnicity and Native Americans. And then below them, you have the native slaves. On the other side of the triangle, the Spanish also brought with them African slaves. So here's a situation where you have another class of people where the Spanish-born or Spanish blood slave owner has children with their African slaves. Then you get mestizos, two different people, two different classes. They have the same level of power, but they are separated by their ethnicity, by their parentage. That system is called the encomienda system and forms a strict social hierarchy amongst the Spanish colonies. Within the strict social hierarchy, that class, the Creole class, they are the educated Spanish-blooded people who have the means to rebel, and in all honesty, have a little bit of that angst. They're the children of pure-blooded Spanish people who were born in Spain, but because of where they were born, because they were born in the colonies and not in Spain, they have fewer rights. That will produce a fair amount of animosity and lead us into revolution.
Simón Bolívar was one of South America's greatest generals and political leaders, whose victories over the Spanish Empire led to the independence of Bolivia, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. Bolívar was born in Caracas, Venezuela in 1783, and lost both of his parents before his 10th birthday. He received a good education and was homeschooled by a number of renowned tutors, who gave the young Bolívar ideas on liberty and free thinking. He was raised by his nanny Hipólita and his tutor Simón Rodriguez. Bolívar then entered the military academy in Venezuela, learning the military and technical strategies that he would later employ in his fight for independence. He then visited Europe, and when he returned to Venezuela in 1807, he was given a military command in New Granada, in modern-day Colombia, to fight against the ruling Spanish of the time. He went on to fight many battles in New Granada, and under his command, new independence was consolidated in 1819. From this victory, he went on to lead successful independence campaigns in Venezuela and Ecuador, and was then made president of the newly formed state of Gran Colombia, which consisted of modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador and Panama, as well as parts of Brazil and Peru. He went on to fully liberate Peru and was then made dictator of the country. Bolívar struggled to maintain control of the new state of Gran Colombia, so he appointed himself dictator as a temporary measure in order to try and save the republic. He resigned his presidency in 1830 after failing to re-establish his authority, and died at the age of 47 later that year. He is known as the George Washington of South America and is considered one of the most important and influential politicians in Latin American history. The country of Bolivia is named in honor of his legacy.
I've given you 5 sets of documents. These 5 sets of documents will give you a sense of what kind of leader Simón Bolívar was. There are leading questions, and I want you to answer those questions with as much detail as you can. At the end, I want you to put together a summary in the final box describing what kind of leader Simón Bolívar was. Was he a nationalist leader who's in keeping with the ideas of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, the French Revolution? Or does he skew a bit more dictatorial like Napoleon did? I'll let you decide that. So, documents below, answer the questions, and then as you're answering the questions, record as much detail as you can from the documents. And then, in the last box, I want you to tell me what kind of leader Simón Bolívar was. Go. Now let's go across the pond, back to Europe, and we'll take a look at how nationalism unifies people. If you were to take a plane in 1850 and you were to fly into Rome, first of all, you'd be a freaking wizard. Secondly, Rome would not be the capital of the country of Italy because the country of Italy didn't exist yet. And then if you were to get back in your plane and you were to fly to Berlin, again, you'd be a wizard. But you wouldn't be landing in Germany because the country of Germany didn't exist yet. which is really weird because oftentimes when we think about like Italy, we think that Italy is thousands of years old. We think about the Roman Empire and all that stuff. In reality, Italy's culture, Italian culture, is wicked old, but the country itself is younger than the United States by almost 100 years. The same goes for Germany. German culture, sorry, I had an itch. German culture is wicked old, but their country is also almost 100 years younger than ours. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at both of these countries and how nationalism was used to unify both of them, making them into powerhouses in the late 1800s and early 1900s, kind of controlling the comings and goings of Europe. So take it away.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So if you look at Europe today, you'll note that two of the European Union's largest economies, Italy and Germany, have not existed as unified kingdoms or sovereign states during our first 26 episodes. We tend to think of Europe's nation-states as static and long-standing, but one of my great-grandfathers was born before Italy became a unified country. Now, I know that I am old, but I'm not that old. What's that? Oh, our script supervisor Zuleha informs me that I am that old. At any rate, all the stereotypes we have of these national identities, that Italians talk with their hands, that Germans have extremely punctual public transport, are quite new, because in 1850, most Italians wouldn't have called themselves Italians. They would have been Genoese or Sicilian or Veronese. The post-revolutionary European world became one of dramatic nation building that ultimately set the stage for 20th century nationalistic fervor. But before we can get nationalist passions riled up, we need to make some more nations. The first of the disruptive nation builders was Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. He set out to create a lavish court, boost the economy, create banks, build railroads, and otherwise modernize France. Politically, he set up a rubber stamp legislature, meaning that mostly they just existed to agree with him, and he also outlawed worker activism. Napoleon III's modus operandi was war, as it would be for many of the nation builders of the mid-19th century, and he helped provoke the Crimean War, a short, miserable, and especially deadly one. In it, France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire fought Russia, which had been challenging Britain across Asia, and the special genius of Napoleon III was to get Austria not to come to the aid of Russia and instead to remain neutral. This cracked the holy alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria that had been set up to stabilize Europe, and Russia's defeat in the war ensured that it would not help squash revolution as it had in 1848. Instead, Russia reeled from its military and other shortcomings. By the 1860s, the Tsar recognized the need to free the serfs, reform the military, and set up modern judicial procedures in order to save its autocratic system, or at least to save it for another 50 years. Let's go to the thought bubble. Napoleon III used the peace after the Crimean War to remake Paris into a modern world capital, and to the south, Camille de Cavour aimed to create a unified Italian state. Like Napoleon, he was an economic modernizer who set up steamship companies, experimented in agriculture, and traveled to see the latest in modernization projects. Cavour became prime minister for the King of Piedmont Sardinia, who allowed him to move forward with these modernization plans. Napoleon III saw advantages in supporting him, so he signed on as an ally in defeating Austria, which controlled northern Italy. Napoleon's idea was that Piedmont would get Austria's territory in northern Italy, Napoleon would get the center, and the Pope would rule kind of an Italian confederation. So, in accordance with this plan, in 1859, Piedmont provoked Austria into declaring war and quickly gained victories. But Cavour and his army looked so good in victory that Italians rallied behind him and were like, I think we want to be Italian and not French. thus thwarting Napoleon's plans. In 1860, the revolutionary and Democrat Giuseppe Garibaldi gathered up 1,000 volunteers, mostly teenagers, clad them in red shirts, and headed by ship to Sicily, where revolts against aristocratic landlords were already underway. He planned to capture the South for a unified Italy, and in 1860 he and his forces succeeded in doing so. Then they moved northward to unite with the forces of Piedmont, and in 1861 the Kingdom of Italy was declared. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So a small pause is necessary here. Why is Garibaldi, a pro-republic romantic leader, working on behalf of a monarch like the King of Piedmont? Why is Cavour, the modernizer and prime minister of a monarchy, joining the likes of Garibaldi? Well, by the 1850s, romantic dreams of national unification and the rule of the people gave way to what is known as realpolitik, or power politics, or realism in politics. Gone were the heartfelt assertions that political actions were the will of God, or that they achieved some divine or romantic destiny on behalf of the nation. Better, it was argued, to be realistic and get things done. German politician Otto von Bismarck expressed realpolitik best when he said, "Germany looks not to Prussia's liberalism. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron." Bismarck became one of the most successful practitioners of realpolitik, and in the process created the modern German Empire. As a young adult, Bismarck's life had basically no seriousness of purpose. I had one of those young adulthoods as well. Born to a well-to-do landed aristocrat or Junker, he was a carouser and imbiber, and generally a lout as a university student. Boy, this is familiar. He built up so many debts that he gave up a career in the civil service to return home and help run the family farm. All right, finally our lives are diverging. And I guess they're about to diverge further, since he was arguably the most important European politician of the second half of the 19th century, and I'm, On the other hand, I've never started a war. Bismarck's life got a lot more serious after he met and married Johanna Puttkamer, a devout Lutheran who gave him a more peaceful home life to balance the political turmoil that he came to embrace. His ultimate ambition was to become a major player in German and international politics, but I've known a lot of drunken and heavily indebted partiers, and they all have big dreams. What makes Bismarck so astonishing is the extent to which he succeeded. He made his return to the political scene as Prussia's delegate to assemblies of the German states, and then as ambassador to Russia, and through these roles, the staunchly monarchist Bismarck learned lessons about diplomacy and international affairs, and about economic liberals and their constitutional values. He came not to oppose a constitution per se, nor to oppose economic progress. What he did, above all else, was support Prussian King William I. So we shouldn't see Bismarck as opposed to this or that kind of reform so much as strongly in favor of a unified Germany under the leadership of a king. In 1862, William I wanted army reform and modernization, as did some liberals, but William refused to budge on certain other provisions, especially a 3-year term for recruits. And Bismarck promised not to budge either, and then went ahead with the king's version of reform, bypassing Parliament altogether by simply collecting taxes and dispensing them as the king wanted. This, among many other actions, made Bismarck enemies of all kinds, partly because of his bullying manner, but he continued to be supported by the one person who really counted, the Prussian king. So for several decades, but most pressingly in the post-1848 atmosphere, a major question was who would lead the Germans, Austria or Prussia? Serving King William I loyally was Bismarck's key to promoting Prussia as the dominant power for Germans. Sometimes people interpret Bismarck as like an all-seeing visionary who carefully plotted every step he took on behalf of Prussia, but historians have now mostly come to believe that Bismarck's political moves were not part of some pre-planned game of 4D chess to outmaneuver Austria. Instead, he just had a gift for improvisation. For example, in 1864, he made an alliance with Austria to settle the status of 2 contested provinces, Schleswig and Holstein. So Bismarck persuaded Austria to join Prussia in war against Denmark to resolve the contested rule of Schleswig-Holstein. Their victory gave Prussia administration of Schleswig, and Austria got Holstein. 2 years later, Prussia and Austria went to war again, this time with each other, over the same 2 provinces. The Austro-Prussian War lasted just over 6 weeks, thanks to Prussia's aforementioned commitment to the professionalism and modernization of its army. So this whole affair was masterfully handled by Bismarck. First, get your enemy Austria to help you defeat your other enemy Denmark, then defeat Austria, and boom, congratulations, you've got Schleswig-Holstein, which only sounds like a disease. But it likely wasn't planned that way, which gets at something important about history. Did the center of the world just open? Is there a magic 8-ball in there? All right, magic 8-ball, is the European Union gonna hold up okay? It is certain. The thing about history is that it always feels certain because, it already happened. So when we in the present look at Bismarck in the past and the unification of Germany, it all feels like extraordinarily strategic. But I would argue that in the multiverse, there's a bunch of worlds where it doesn't work out the way that it worked out for us. History is what happens to have happened, and we are all making that together, just as Bismarck and everyone else in 19th century Europe was making it. But back to Bismarck. So following this big victory, King William wanted to keep going, to capture Vienna and maybe even Hungary, but Bismarck, with his usual astuteness in international affairs, encouraged the king to pull back and consolidate, as Prussia was now the leading German nation. Bismarck had drawn the northern German kingdoms and states into the North German Confederation, while also aiming to draw in the German states that were still resisting joining Prussia, and how he did this was kind of brilliant in a dark artsy sort of way. Bismarck deeply understood the growing power of mass market media like newspapers, and he knew how to feed rumors to them. For instance, there was a battle over who would take the throne of tiny Luxembourg, someone allied with Prussia or someone allied with Napoleon III. As the contest heated up, Bismarck got a personal quote in the papers to the effect that the French were, quote, not the fine people they are usually considered to be, and were, in fact, loud-mouthed people given over to bold, violent behavior. Meanwhile, he also doctored a telegram sent from the Prussian king to make it appear insulting to the French, and then in August 1870, the French National Assembly, outraged at these characterizations, declared war. The French were handily defeated, with Napoleon III and an army of 150,000 people captured on September 2nd. The Bavarians, along with smaller states, then had to join Prussia, and in January of 1871, the German Empire was declared in the Hall of Mirrors at the Versailles Palace, and all because of Luxembourg. Although much of the earlier opposition to Bismarck had died down at this point, he still had to forge a nation from these disparate states, one with its own institutions and its own culture. This was a fraught task, which he did in his signature style, more experimentally than sure-footedly. Bismarck's specific moves to unite the many German states into a consolidated entity are now called negative integration, that is, building a community or nation by finding enemies or targeting certain categories of individuals to be outcasts. Negative integration is opposed to positive integration based on acts like sharing values and building consensus among citizens. In the 1870s, Bismarck chose to harass, disadvantage, and insult Catholics with the idea of turning citizens against them and uniting Germany in opposition to Catholicism. The cluster of policies against Catholics was called Kulturkampf, and eventually Bismarck abandoned it, not because he didn't want it to work, but because there was widespread outrage among Germans, including Protestants, at the idea of upending religious toleration and making fellow citizens outcasts. Next, Bismarck targeted workers, especially Social Democrats, aka Socialists. Social Democrats were increasing their numbers in elections, and also there were 2 assassination attempts on William I's life, which Bismarck used as an excuse for outlawing the Social Democratic Party. Obviously, it's very important to understand how negative integration works and how the systematic dehumanization of an other to unite a country can become not just problematic, but indeed catastrophic. And I want to be clear that Bismarck didn't invent negative integration or anything, but he did use it. He also put into effect the first social welfare program in the West, which included accident and sickness protection for workers and also unemployment benefits, which were crucial because beginning in 1873, Europe and the world experienced an economic downturn that started in industry, not in agriculture, as had been the case in the past. In a letter to his wife, Bismarck had called Prussia's defeat of France a great event in world history. And so it was, as in Italy, and some would say the United States, victories of professional armies had created unified nations. And it's important to understand that nations were not inevitable or natural forms. Some were built on creating shared beliefs and constitutions. In others, negative integration was key to nation building as countries identified themselves in opposition to others or by clearly defining what they weren't. In Germany, the aristocratic land-owning office corps became demigods to the citizenry that believed in them and in military might, while industrialists and economic innovators fell behind in political influence. And when you think about your own communities, whether that's a nation state or a fandom, I think it's interesting to consider whether you are defined primarily by what you share or by what you are, or defined primarily by what you are not or what you are opposed to. We'll see how the many ingredients of nation building evolved in ways both promising and terrifying as Crash Course heads toward the 20th century. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
And with that, we bid a fond adieu to nationalism. It's like we hardly knew you. We've laughed, we've cried, we've been through a lot together. You, me, and nationalism. But don't worry, it's not going away. In fact, it's one of the many isms that's going to be around for the rest of the course. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful week. Don't forget to smash that bell. I don't know, they say it on the YouTubes. With that, see ya.